So, hello and welcome to the second meeting of the Turba Autumn 2024. So, thank you for everyone who's joining. I'm aware that it's Black Friday, and for anyone joining us from the US, it's also Thanksgiving, I believe. So, just thanks for making the time to join us or to look at this. Um, of course, I would like to thank, as always, the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry for their support in providing us with the Zoom, and also for basically allowing us to upload this online. This will be uploaded probably on Monday or by Monday on the Shack YouTube channel in case you would like to see it there or to review it. So today I am pleased to introduce Sergei Zotov, who recently finished his PhD at the University of Warwick. And this was his PhD was entitled Alchemical Iconography as a Mediator of Knowledge. So Sergey at the moment is a early career fellow at the University of Warwick at the Institute of Advanced Studies, and he will be also starting a Francis Yates long-term fellowship at the Warburg Institute, so early next year. So he's here with me to discuss the role of the visual example in the transmission of the late medieval alchemical iconography. Sergey, welcome, and please feel free to start at your convenience and share your PowerPoint.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, for kind introduction and for inviting me. And yeah, hello everyone. Nice to see you all. Yeah, so this work is not exactly part of my dissertation, so it's very much work in progress. So if you have any suggestions, thoughts, please welcome to discuss it after, and we'll be very much pleased to hear what you think. So, if you have ever wondered why certain images in the European alchemical tradition were consistently copied from one manuscript to another, often with minimal alteration, you're not alone. Examining the androgynous figure in the early 15th century Book of the Holy Trinity, one of the first alchemical books to feature allegorical depictions of alchemical processes, we find that this image migrated into over 20 copies of the treatise and appeared in other alchemical treatises as well, including Vera Scientia, a shorter version of Vera Scientia, Rosarium Philosophorum, Aurora Consurgens, Splendor Solis, Vessels of Hermes, and various illustrated alchemical miscellanies. In the Book of the Holy Trinity, there is no description of this image, which raises the question of how it was transmitted. Was it copied directly from one manuscript to another? While some alchemical manuscripts are exact reproductions of others, in cases where manuscripts were replicated without detailed textual descriptions and across different regions, how do they still contain identical images? My hypothesis is straightforward. Illustrated alchemical books were copied in much the same way as other late medieval manuscripts. While this may not seem immediately apparent, especially considering the sometimes unusual nature of these images, alchemical illustrations were frequently reproduced. For instance, my research indicates over 100 illustrated copies of Donum Dei, at least 55 of Crowning of Nature, 34 of Rosarium Philosophorum, and many others. This suggests that images from these and similar treatises were widely recognized and repeatedly copied across Europe. But how was this replication achieved? Medieval traditions of illumination relied on the idea of the authority of the past, just as for all other forms of knowledge in this period. Each particular image in a copy was consistently drawn after an exemplum or in accordance with specialized iconographical guides created by experienced illuminators to utilize them as support in artistic work. These manuals served as valuable resources for illuminators, painters, and sculptors. The visual elements and motifs found within them were often referenced during pilgrimages to churches or while studying manuscripts in libraries, especially considering the limited access to these materials. In this regard, medieval alchemical books are not unique. They participated in the same tradition of copying as secular or religious books, and their illuminators were most likely using iconographical guides or were actively drawing upon other images. We can examine one of the most renowned iconographical guides of all times, the 13th century sketchbook of Villard de Ronecourt, which contains over 250 images of various objects, figures, and scenes accompanied by brief notes. Let us recall how this book functioned. Each folio presents thematically grouped images, serving as templates for transferring them to new manuscripts. For example, on the left side here, we find samples for bestiary with space allocated for fantastical creatures as suggested by the Minotaur's labyrinths. On the right, we enter an artist's workshop, observing precisely how to draw human faces or animal bodies, beginning with basic geometric shapes. Such layouts not only guided the act of copying, but also encouraged artistic continuity across manuscript copies. Most of the images, indeed, the majority of them, were copied exactly as they appeared in the iconographical guide. What is the power of convention? I will refer to this principle as iconographical continuity, which serves as the key theoretical model for my paper today. Previously, it was known as iconographical stability, a term used by numerous art historians and likely first coined by Michael Camille in his work on medieval iconography, particularly in relation to marginalia. In this context of alchemical manuscripts, I prefer to use the term iconographical continuity, as alchemical images were not always stable and often underwent changes. However, the overall structure remained consistent, which makes continuity a more appropriate designation. Thus, iconographical continuity is defined as the reuse of motifs from older images, often reproduced exactly as in the original, driven by the concept of an image pervading authority and perenniality. Let us consider other examples of medieval iconographic guides. The Rhein Musterbuch, created in the 13th century, includes images of various beasts and biblical scenes. Some sketches remain unfinished, and the figure at the bottom appears to break the fourth wall, gazing upward at the image above, much like the figure at the base of the famous Ripley scroll. This iconographic guide comprises only the first 13 folios on the manuscript, underscoring its draft-like nature. These images were not intended for contemplation, but were sketched as templates for more elaborate copies. Another significant example is the Wolfenbüttel Model Book, a section added to a manuscript containing older texts, utilizing an area left without any text. This approach was practical. Manuscript production was costly, and no one wanted to waste additional parchment, probably sourced from another flock of lambs, just to make sketches for training or future copying. The Wolfenbüttel Model Book is now recognized as key evidence of artistic motif transmission between Byzantium and Western Europe in the 13th century, reflecting how artists relied on their own copies to reproduce and adapt images encountered abroad. A 13th century medicinal miscellany from Prague offers a similar example. An anonymous artist sees the alluring chance to use every inch of space as a sketchbook in just a couple of blank pages between treatises. Judging by the subjects depicted, the artist was likely practicing hybrid creatures for use in marginalia and manuscript decoration. Many of these drawings appear more polished than typical draft images, suggesting they may have served as models for future clean copies. The last example of iconographic guides, though there are many others, is the sketchbook by the Italian artist, architect, and illuminator Giovannino de Grassi, who lived in the 14th century Italy. This manuscript consists solely of a portfolio of his drawings, without any accompanying notes. These drawings served as models for painting, illumination, frescoes, and sculpture. For instance, some details of the fresco in the Mantegazza family castle in Campo Morto in Pavia were directly copied from this album. Within this artistic collection, we find numerous depictions of animals from contemporary natural history treatises and drawings of people. Additionally, there is an intricately designed alphabet, likely intended for illuminated initials. Such drawings were commonly featured in iconographic guides. Could an alchemical iconography guide exist? I believe the answer is yes. For instance, in this alchemical and astrological miscellany, we find a special page featuring an alphabet with decorated letters. Surrounded by alchemical treatises, this image suggests that the scribe may have been working on practical iconographic guides. However, aside from the usual marginal depictions of apparatus, no draft of alchemical images are present in this manuscript. However, many alchemical treatises may have clearly been used as iconographic guides, though they have not previously been recognized as such. For example, this copy of the Book of the Holy Trinity from Kassel presents all the images of the treatise on just 5 pages, rather than dedicating individual pages to each image. The depictions are not grouped in any specific order. Motifs such as the serpent alongside Adam and Eve, or the Virgin holding Christ on the lily cross, appear on the same page. This arrangement doesn't serve to elucidate the complex allegories, suggesting that the manuscript was created not for understanding, but for copying the images into a clean manuscript with illuminations. Therefore, this unusual arrangement of images was not due to a lack of space as seen in another copy of the Book of the Holy Trinity, but was intentional, aimed at facilitating the production of a more refined copy of the same treatise later. It was merely a working copy, with draft text and images. When we view other alchemical manuscripts through this lens, we begin to identify additional alchemical model books. For instance, here is the well-known version of the Rosarium Philosophorum created in England in the early 17th century and subsequently censored by some devout Anglicans to remove inappropriate religious imagery. Similar to the previous example, all the images, including even the printer's device, which is insignificant to the image series, are copied meticulously to fit as many depictions as possible onto one page. Given the absence of text in this section and the lack of even the usual brief titles for each image, it is clear that this manuscript was not intended for viewing, but rather as a template for later, more intricate illuminations. Another comparable example is a late 16th century English copy of Coronatio Naturae, or Crowning of Nature. This treatise typically comprises 67 textless images, each placed individually on a folio. However, in this example, we see an unusual arrangement of all the images condensed onto just 3 pages. The first image can be considered as somewhat detailed draft, while the next 14 are at least sketched in bare outlines. The remaining 53 consist merely of empty circles with accompanying titles. Clearly, the scribe didn't complete their work. However, it is evident that there was no intention to further elaborate on the image series, as it occupies just 1.5 folios instead of probably 67. The goal appears to have been to create a miniature iconographic guide to assist other illuminators in using these sketches as templates for producing a full-colored version, the design of which was widely known. We often encounter iconographic guides dedicated to specific alchemical series, but this was not the only way to create an alchemical model book. Like many other model books, there were instances where images from various alchemical manuscripts were compiled, presumably for an illuminator intending to produce multiple illustrated series within a single manuscript. Such a task seems to have been undertaken in this alchemical album from northern Italy produced around the 1560s. Here we find draft images from the Book of the Holy Trinity alongside symbolic depictions from the Rosarium Philosophorum and Donum Dei, as well as various apparatus, schemes, diagrams, and tables. The inclusion of images from different treatises highlights the draft nature of this iconographic guide, intended as a source of inspiration for a skilled artist. Not every alchemical iconographic guide served as a model for specific images. Some contained ideas for further experimentation and application in later works. We can observe this in the famous version of the Ripley scroll from Bodleian Library. At the top of the scroll, there is a unique set of images that do not seem to connect directly to the main themes of the Ripley scroll. These include depictions of a skeleton inside a coffin and a dead naked woman in a tomb giving birth to a child through a hole in her abdomen. These images are likely inspired by the allegorical series from Petrus Bonus' Pretiosa Margherita novella, where the skeleton of a king is placed in a coffin-like vessel and resurrected as a philosopher's stone. Additionally, 6 unusual emblems appear, which do not seem to exist in any other alchemical manuscript, at least I don't know them, including one showing a youth riding on a frog and another resembling a reddish root. Perhaps these motifs drawn from Rippling poetry or other illuminated treatises, although I didn't find any traces of them. There are also 4 empty frames designed in the same style as those appearing in the scroll itself, possibly some unfinished experiments. This unusual set of images seems to represent either alchemical allegories from other treatises or those invented by the illuminator himself or herself, who utilized the available space to draft new ideas for future works. We know that although rare, alchemical manuscripts were occasionally commissioned by wealthy patrons and entrusted to famous artists for illumination. However, this was not often the case. In most instances, alchemical image series were illuminated by the alchemists themselves. This is why, while chemical iconography guides produced by professional illuminators can occasionally be found, they remain rare. More often, separate iconographic models for specific images of crucial importance were used. This method was more easily implemented, enabling even less skilled artists to transmit visual knowledge effectively. For instance, an excerpt from the Book of the Holy Trinity, produced in Germany in the late 16th century, features minimal text and only one schematic draft of the Wheel of Virtues. Unlike more complex images of Christ, Adam and Eve, or Holy Mary, this scheme was simple enough for an unskilled artist to reproduce while still conveying the necessary knowledge. Another example is a 15th century copy of the Book of the Holy Trinity from Wolfenbüttel, which contained almost all the allegorical images, but lacked several diagrams, some of which were likely cut from the manuscript by some users. Someone later drafted the missing diagrams and added a schematic drawing of an illumination absent from this version. Although these tiny images were not particularly comprehensible, this is what it should be, they were likely created for a knowledgeable person who was already familiar with their full form and could expand them into complete illuminations. These examples may have also served as drafts for further elaboration into fully developed images. We can see how important it was to draft certain allegorical images that were not merely decorative, but also carried significant alchemical meanings. In one of the oldest copies of the Book of the Holy Trinity, made around 1416, we find only 2 images, a scheme of the Wheel of Virtues and the triumphant androgyne, the most crucial image of the series. This image symbolizes the idea of the philosopher's stone, where the masculine principle of sulfur and the feminine principle of mercury are literally merged together. It also represents the spiritual union of the Virgin Mary and Christ, making them one. The text of this copy contains numerous mistakes and missing passages, suggesting that it was intended as a draft. Nevertheless, despite being a draft, the scribe added this illumination to the page, incorporating 6 different colors. This underscores the importance of the images for understanding the content of alchemical books. Colors are essential for interpreting this allegory, as they represent the 4 elements and 2 alchemical principles through distinct hues, so the illuminator used them even in the draft copy. The colors were of utmost importance for those drafting alchemical images, which is evident from the next 2 examples, where the allegorical coat of arms of the Trinity is depicted in 2 different fully illuminated copies of the Book of the Holy Trinity. In the first instance, certain pigments were probably not available to the scribe, so they included small inscriptions such as yellow, golden, and blue, indicating the colors they intended to use in the final version of the image. This also served as a signal to the reader of the unfinished version, indicating that the colors should be applied as specified to better understand the image. In the next example, we again see the manuscript from Kassel, which contains the iconographical guide for the Book of the Holy Trinity. This manuscript also features a very interesting simplified series of images from Donum Dei, possibly intended as a model for an artist as well. Supporting this theory is the fact that the colorless images are accompanied, as in the previous case, by markings indicating the colors with which certain fragments of the images should be painted, similar to children's coloring books. For instance, the flowers are marked to be from left to right, yellow, white, and red. I have examined all the copies of Donum Dei with colored illustrations that I have encountered, over 40 different manuscripts, and none of them display this particular color sequence. The closest to this concept is the version from Glasgow, where we see the idea of 7 different metals associated with 7 differently colored petals of the flower. The next image again features color markings inside the vessel and on the flowers. The colors inside the vessel are green, blue, and red from bottom to top. And the colors of the flowers are from left to right, white, green, and red. The colors inside the vessel are replicated in some manuscripts I have observed. For example, in the Nuremberg copy, the background in the middle of the vessel is also marked as blue, as labeled near the naked figures. However, the color itself is absent. Blue was an expensive pigment and likely not available for the illuminator. Interestingly, the Castle copy presents a very unusual color scheme for the flowers again, which doesn't occur in any other manuscript. This may be because the scribe mistakenly borrowed the color scheme for the flowers in this image from the following image, which they actually never reproduced. We can see how this looks in other manuscripts. For example, in one of the Polish copies from Katowice, the 3 flowers are shown in black, white, and red, which makes more sense as they correspond to the 3 main alchemical stages. These flowers are also labeled Nigra, Alba, and Rubea, respectively. Therefore, we see that color marking was a popular tool for creating draft images intended for modeling and further reproduction. Having examined some of the most striking examples of alchemical iconographical guides, we can now turn to the draft images found in finished manuscripts. Certain alchemical treatises show clear traces of the image copying process. Initially, a preliminary draft was prepared either by the guiding alchemist scribe or miniaturist, often while copying from another book. If the draft was successful, it was either discarded or retained as part of the draft book, of course, as previously discussed. And if unsuccessful, the draft might be abandoned and a new version could be created from scratch on a different page. Occasionally, these unfinished sketches remain in the manuscripts, sometimes left directly near the completed images, offering valuable insights into the artist's creative processes and copying techniques. We find a unique instance of an unfinished sketch left in a completed manuscript among other finished images in a late 15th century copy of the Book of the Holy Trinity. In all other copies, this particular image is not mirrored. However, in this draft, it is. This observation suggests that the unfinished sketch may actually be a copy of the finished image, as it is located on the page immediately following it. It is possible that the artist used an available blank space on the earlier page to practice replicating the image, employing the outlines of the finished version, which might have been faintly visible through the paper as a guide. The result, however, was imperfect, as you can see on the left. Interestingly, the draft appears on the folio where the text on the right describes the image's meaning. This positioning suggests that even as an incomplete draft, this image might have served a functional purpose, allowing readers to grasp the image's description without turning the page back and forth. In the 17th century German illustrated alchemical collection, we encounter a different technique for drawings arranged side by side, seemingly created to practice depicting a statue of Paracelsus as a Germanic knight. The sequence begins with a sketch of his face, followed by a bust, a full-length depiction on a pedestal, and finally a colored version of the draft. This page likely served as a small iconographic guide for the illuminator's future work, or perhaps functioned as a trial run to refine their composition. Such trial runs are also known from an Islamic alchemical manuscript copy of the Mirror of Wonders, as discussed in Julian Müller's article. In this example, a full-sized colored version of the image appears on the same page where a marginal sketch is positioned. The high-quality colored image is likely a refined version, while a scribe probably made a marginal sketch to illustrate how the composition described in the nearby text should look. The scribe did it because they likely copied the text from another illuminated manuscript, and the images were unavailable to the illuminator. In an illustration depicting the famous ora et labora principle in one of the copies of Conrad's treatise, we observe guiding lines that the miniaturist clearly used to facilitate drawing an image with complex perspective, dividing it into smaller segments. A similar technique is found already in Unicourt's iconographic guides, though here the key distinction is that this appears to be a finished copy rather than a template for further use. As we have seen today, the practice of image copying in alchemical treatises reveals a rich process of transmission and adaptation. Alchemical manuscripts often feature drafts, color markings, and model images that served not only as templates for further elaboration, but also as tools for the dissemination of visual knowledge. These guides, whether rough sketches or fully illuminated images, allowed alchemists and illuminators to convey complex allegories and concepts across time and space. Through this process, we gain a deeper understanding of how alchemical imagery evolved and was shared within the alchemical community. Finally, I want to highlight what happens when copying goes wrong. One of the images from the Crowning of Nature series depicts the three principles of nature: vegetable, animal, and mineral, initially represented by three trees positioned together in 16th century copies. However, by the 17th century, this image evolved into two trees and a dead tree, which in late 17th century depictions was often represented as a tree stump. In the 18th century, possibly due to an artist's mistake, this motif mutated further, resulting in two trees and a human leg. The emergence of the leg in these images may be traced to the way the stump was depicted in some manuscripts, where it resembled a leg when sketched with a pencil briefly. One copy, created around 1697, depicts the stump in an ambiguous form, which may have been interpreted by later artists as something unclear, resembling both a stump and a leg. Subsequent illuminators produced more realistic copies featuring the human leg, leaning towards this interpretation, as you can see on the left. The late illuminators likely chose the leg over the stump because it provided actually a more fitting emblematic representation of the three realms: mineral nature symbolized by rock, vegetative nature by tree, and animal nature by the human leg. So this is another example why iconographic guides were used and were important for alchemical iconography. Thank you. This is the end of my paper. Thanks.
Thank you, Sergey. That was quite illuminating, let's say, in a pun. Um, could you, for now, close your PowerPoint so we can just make it available if people want to refer to specific images. Well, that was very interesting, especially in highlighting, I think, the importance, I think, of the drafts in the process of creating imagery. And of course it kind of leads to the question of what is finished and what is a draft. I mean, it's like, at what point is it a finished product, and how important is the draft? I mean, it's Is it and what does it represent in art? And I mean, I don't have the questions, the answers because I don't know how art is seen. But of course, when you think about like more famous, like Leonardo and all these kind of drafts of Renaissance paintings, you think, okay, this is also very important in the process. The process of making art is just as important as the ultimate product itself. And I don't know what you think about this aspect. I mean, how important are the drafts in um, also from an artistic point of view, maybe.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think it's a very important question about the distinction, what is actually draft and what is the final product, because I mean, sometimes we just don't know. And it's sometimes possible to grasp this when you see the manuscript itself, when you, I mean, touch it and see the whole content, not just digitally reproduced, because it's giving you some, context. And the constant context of a draft is usually that, well, the text is not from this manuscript, but from some other treatise, for example, and some images are placed somewhere where they shouldn't be. And sometimes it's just unfinished images and you can clearly see it. But sometimes there are also manuscripts which is hard to interpret as a draft or like a finished manuscript because there is no clear distinction. Nobody like put a signature and said this is a complete finished copy with all the illuminations. Sometimes there is just text and like empty space for eliminations, which never were done actually. And yeah, it's sometimes it's hard to say, but I think that which is important that sometimes we can say clearly this is a draft, and I'm actually quite surprised that I think no one never like did this for alchemical manuscript because they were clearly used these drafts, the illuminators, they were using this because these were sometimes the same illuminators who did other illuminations for non-alchemical books. So um, this is quite interesting that they had also this system of markings, how to make a full image for the subsequent illuminator. Yes, so sometimes we cannot say really which is yeah, a challenging task. But in terms of artistic conventions, I think it's quite important to see how it goes in a draft because sometimes a mistake in a draft results in a mistake in a full finished version, which is also interesting. So basically, we can see how the ways of copying were the evolution of the ways of copying, and we can trace it back to the drafts and see even if sometimes in printed images we can see some alterations or mistakes so to say. So they were some of them were probably because of these drafts and mistakes in them.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean it's interesting. I mean it's also raises the question of what a mistake is. I mean I mean is it I mean do you follow? I mean is it the text that is maybe the most important in deciding what let's say they are depicting something that is happening in the text, or is the image self-enclosed and maybe the draft is the right one and then alterations are the mistake? Or I mean how do you like how do you know that something is a mistake or not? That's another question.
Yeah, well, about mistakes, well, of course, it's a kind of a judging term. Maybe we shouldn't use it, but sometimes it's obviously kind of a mistake because it's clearly says in the text, let's say green line, and
Mm.
it should be green line because that's basically an acid which dissolves gold and so on. And when you see the image, it's like golden line because probably they didn't have enough green paint, or probably they just wanted to make it gold because it looks beautiful. But sometimes it's just an alteration, like with the leg. For example, Crowning of Nature basically, well, there is some text, but the text varies very much from copy to copy, and there is no like widely known. text of Crown of Nature. It's always different. And in this text, you don't have any like descriptions of the images. It's totally different from the images. And so basically, when someone depicted a leg instead of a tree, well, it's possible because there is no canon of this image, basically. And the canon is only visual. So we can now trace how it looks, how what was behind the thinking of the illuminator, why they chose like the leg, because it resembled a tree in one of the copies. But I mean, still, it's not exactly a mistake. It's an interpretation, I think, and actually it fit better. So sometimes these alterations they change the whole meaning of the image series, and actually sometimes it worked even better with the alteration than without it.
Mhm. Okay, I see Emmy has her hand up, so Emmy, if you would like to ask the question.
Actually, Dagmar had her hand waving
Oh,
earlier. She
sorry,
wanted to
but I
go
didn't I
earlier.
didn't notice
Sorry,
when you asked.
I should have put up my virtual hand,
Oh,
but actually,
sorry,
my
I don't have
question,
the gallery
no,
in front of me, so.
no problem. I actually had the same thing about the mistake. That was sort of I was wondering about the mistake and sort of the agency of the artist. But one thing that was striking me about these images was that if you have a booklet in a way, you don't need to have somebody who understands the image, right? You can just have any artist making that picture. But with the leg, it seems to me like there was somebody who understood alchemical metaphor and so on. I'm just thinking about this because I'm looking at Sanskrit manuscripts, alchemical manuscripts. They have images, but of apparatuses. They're sort of technical drawings. And there you can see very often that the person making the drawing had no idea what they were drawing and got it wrong because of that. It's very obvious. You can just see sort of, how it gets worse and worse, copy by copy in the manuscript. But here with these books, you're kind of taking away this possibility of error in some sense, made by somebody who doesn't understand alchemy. But do you think these images were made by alchemists or just by artists? Yeah. What's your
Yeah, thanks, Dagmar. It's actually a very important question as well, because I believe that the majority of these like fancy images were not made by alchemists. They were designed by alchemists, and that's why precisely why we see some sketches and drawings sometimes by alchemists themselves, or at least by the scribes who copied these images, how they could copy them, like in a very, unartistic, unskilled, so to say, way, uh, to give the meaning to the actual artist who didn't know anything about alchemy, but was very skilled in, making a composition and so on. And that's why we actually have these kind of alchemical mistakes when the color is wrong or something else. And sometimes we see this in these commissioned manuscripts. Like, for example, Book of the Holy Trinity was fairly commissioned. Majority of copies were commissioned for rich aristocrats, and it was a special case. But when we have other manuscripts, the majority of them, alchemical manuscripts were created by alchemists themselves. They didn't have enough money to pay for very skillful artists, and they just did it themselves, or just someone probably worked together with some friend, I don't know. And actually there is a recent article by Berit Wagner about the creation of the important 16th century alchemical album, I think from Leiden, this important one, VCF 27, I believe. And she actually finds the guy who was the artist for The Alchemist. So it was a duo of alchemist and the artist was quite famous. He was an Erfurt in Germany. And he was quite famous. He was illuminating other manuscripts, for example, astrological and Christian manuscripts like Bibles. And they were working together. Obviously, this alchemist who wanted to produce an illuminated treatise, he wanted to show him, the artist, the images from other books also from not from printed books, but from books from private libraries, from monastic libraries. So it was quite tricky in the time, but they achieved the amazing quality. And I mean, it's ever since one of the most fascinating manuscripts, I think. So they were working as a tandem of two people, basically. And I think it was the case for the majority of this kind of commissioned manuscripts. But sometimes we just don't know the names, unfortunately.
Thank you.
So, Amy, can you?
Yeah, so hi, Sergey. It's good to see you again. It's been a
Hi.
long time.
Good
And
to
congratulations on trying to figure out this very complicated matter. I'm often working with the inconsistencies, the mistakes. Those are most interesting to me. And I think that, for several of the things that you showed that you were talking about as being drafts, they're really late. They're a lot later than the manuscripts that have the much more complete manuscript. So I think from my point of view, some of those really are copies that were made. Somebody wanted a new manuscript. They knew that a better one earlier existed. They wanted somebody to copy down. Maybe they couldn't afford the illustrations right away. Can you just give me some sketches about what the real one looks like? And so I think that that's one of the ways that these extra images appear together. I think that the other thing to think about is, it's not like we've got a scriptorium in a monastery in which multiple copies of a Bible, say, are being produced. These were often, I think, maybe single commissions, more so than you think, like the Book of the Holy Trinity, where some prince wants a copy of it, and therefore, they go to a greater expense. But then you get to the Crowning of Nature, where there were clearly multiple versions sent out there for people to hand color and lots of mistakes made with those. So I just think it's just so complicated. One of the things that has interested me about the Book of the Holy Trinity is the number of flowers on either side of the androgyne is always changing, like why was that, and like the Ripley scroll, the ones that I think the Huntington is the only one that has the king and the scribe. And then there's a manuscript where the king gets torn off, and then the scribe is on one side, and then he moves to the middle. So, it helps to sequence the order of these things, but I don't think you can come up with a one answer to why all of these things are happening because, and we don't know. It's frustrating because we don't know much about the production, who was there. It's rare to have the name of the artist. So anyway, congratulations on finishing your dissertation and best wishes for your future. I hope our paths cross again.
Yeah, me too. Thank you, Emmy, for these ideas. Well, I think it's actually hard to distinguish sometimes between what you said. It could be a manuscript, just a brief sketches of a cheap copy, so to say, to just have it without any fancy images. And the actual draft made for, future artists illuminating this in a good way. And I think sometimes we can say for sure that it was a draft. For example, this early Book of the Holy Trinity from Wellcome Library, which is clearly a draft based
Yes.
on text and
Yeah.
so on. This is actually fascinating that we have an actual illumination with 6 different colors because it's not what draft is about. It's not about coloring images. So perhaps sometimes in the 15th century, if you had a draft, probably you knew that it's only thing you will have because to produce a manuscript, it takes a long time. And meanwhile, you still want to have a nice book. So at least one illumination was probably enough for these purposes, like the central one. And this is actually, I think, giving us interesting point of view of the alchemist's inner kind of workshop, which illumination is the main one in the whole manuscript. So clearly, for someone possessing this manuscript, it was the androgynous figure, which is quite interesting, I think. But of course, some of the sketches are just, copies made by alchemists, and they never thought they would be illuminated, I think. But this is mostly these early modern copies when alchemists, they started to, copy a lot of illuminated alchemical manuscripts. And I mean, Isaac Newton himself made some illustrations as well. They're kind of, well, they're good. But of course, from their artistic point of view, they're not like, Leonardo da Vinci. uh, so, yeah. Sometimes it's hard to say, unfortunately, but I hope to find a way to clear it somehow.
Thank you.
Peter Oakley has a question.
Hi, thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you very much for that, Sergei. There's been a lot of things to think about. I also have a specific question, but just to note sort of some of the commentaries. Uh, you were mentioning Newton. The copy of Newton's Optics, the original publication, has no color in it, and he's representing everything by notes of color, which actually make the book incredibly difficult to understand until you see later representations of what he's trying to do, where the colors are put in for his notes. So I think that there is one aspect about the fact of not having the opportunity of being able to print in color or to access to colors. I've also seen the same thing happen with artist notebooks or sketchbooks from much later. So when things are being done on site, people make notes about what the color is going to be that they're going to use as an aid memoir for later. And I'm wondering, there's also, when you're talking about copying, it may be that people have very limited access to the original, or not even having any drawing materials at the time when they see the original, and the thing is being done from memory, so that there's a sort of degradation of having a very limited access to the original and then having to reproduce it, sitting there that evening in your in a private room in order to be able to copy the thing out. So some of these things may come from that, not about the aspect that the person doesn't understand, but they just can't remember what they saw for a limited amount of time. I don't know that I can't see that there's any real way of, determining the two, but I would flag that quite a lot of these things are being done like that. Um, it's not necessarily that someone has an infinite amount of time to sit and look at the original and produce as much of a visual copy as possible. Some of it may just be that you've got to try and remember something, walk out the door, and it's a bit like the game, Kim's game with the tray, where you show the thing, put it, and then people can't even remember what on earth is on the tray to half an hour later. So I think that's one of the things that might have happened. And I'm thinking of that because I keep a sketchbook for now, and it's amazing how you can suddenly find you haven't got anything that's green, and you put in a replacement and then forget that's there's practicalities about this. But the one thing I was particularly interested in, is there any indication of people later working back into images to make them more representative, where there was a sketch itself and you can see that it's being tidied up or made to look more impressive? It may be that something that's got the notation of the color and then you see the color being applied. Have you come across anything like that, or something where you can see that there's overworking that takes place?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yes, exactly about the coloration markings. I've seen some manuscripts. Actually, I think I showed even one, but this was a tiny image in the middle where you can see the color markings and the actual color applied after these markings. So it was sometimes the same color, sometimes it was different color, which is more interesting. So probably they didn't have enough color in the palette, and they just applied some 2 instead of 3, for example. But generally, I think, especially when the illumination was a very high quality, you cannot say without special aperture, which I don't know how to use actually. It's probably X-rays you can use for seeing the layers, but on the paper, I don't know how it works without destroying the actual illumination. Because sometimes, you just apply some layer of paint, and then you cannot see anything. So if it's yeah, in some manuscripts on paper we can see clearly the markings, and that someone was working on the draft and then putting this, like in a in these books we colored when we've been kids. But it's not always visible. So it's interesting actually to apply some, X-ray techniques probably on these manuscripts, but I'm not sure it works how it works with the paintings, because with the paintings you can see clearly the different layers and how it was drafted and so on. Sometimes, not always, but I'm not sure how it works on paper. Actually, it's very interesting. And yeah, about the mistakes or alterations because people were working from memory. I think this is absolutely true, because sometimes it was a very limited amount of time people seen the original, for example, and they clearly made it from fragmented, fractioned memories. And in some manuscript, you see that it's totally different composition, for example. And I think this is one of the most plausible explanations. We have a luxury to have cameras, and yeah, they didn't have it.
Yeah. Could I just ask a quick follow-on question? Do you ever see evidence of pouncing? So where people are
Yes,
marking with the dots so that they can then
yes.
put the thing through to the image below.
Yeah, actually, I cut it from my presentation because it was too long. But actually, I can show you a couple of examples, because I think for alchemy it was quite um, early modern thing. I haven't seen any in the medieval manuscripts, but maybe I just didn't come across. But for example, in Crowning of Nature again, we can see this pouncing
Yeah.
all and over again. Like here or in a Cambridge manuscript, this pouncing. And I believe that pouncing began as a technique of copying the illuminations, at least in the 13th century, but not in alchemical manuscripts, of course. But for example, this very important and famous Krauss bestiary, you see this kind of Ouroboros dragon on the right, and this is being pounced many, many times. So basically, this illumination, well, we can think, okay, this is ruined now because it's pounced all over. But I mean, it was still in use afterwards, and some of the images are pounced, some are not. So some were reproduced, basically, some not. And yeah, I found many other examples, like from treatises on astrology or chiromancy, like you see on the right. But basically, yes, it was used, for example, here in the copy from St. Andrews about, well, it's basically Basil Valentine's treatise with some sketches around it. And there is a piece of paper where someone just pounced the image of, furnace with some cooker bits and probably copied somewhere else. So it's interesting because it's not a very elaborate drawing, so I don't believe that it was impossible to draw, but nevertheless they did it. And here, for example, yes, well, it's quite tricky to um, draw it if you're not an artist. So someone just basically ruined this and made a copy, probably. And the same is here. And here it's interesting. This is a copy from Glasgow that actually every image is heavily pounced. So basically all these 67 images are pounced, which doesn't make any of these images actually kind of incomprehensible. You can still,
Yeah.
read it, right?
It is a technique that's also used to transfer things to other materials. So you quite often use pouncing if people have textiles, because what you use is you not well, it can be done with ink, but it can be done with a white powder or soot that's wiped off of the original image, and it's transferred onto the textile for embroidery, or it's transferred onto ceramic for painting on ceramic. So I'm not necessarily saying that that's what's been used for these, but it's used in multiple ways. It's not just used for creating a copy of the original image. So there are people, and it's also used for engravings as well later on. as a way of transferring images from paper onto the metal for engravings. So it has quite a quite profound interest in terms of what else it's going to be used for when you find a pounced image, because it might not be that it's another manuscript. It might be that it's being transferred into another media.
Yeah, well, this is really interesting. Thank you for raising this, because I didn't actually, I haven't seen this opportunity for artists to create something else, not a manuscript from manuscript, but actually use it for textiles. I'm not sure why alchemists would use it for textiles, but for engravings or even for ceramics, I think it's could be so. It's interesting to explore, I think. I don't think I ever encountered any alchemical motif in textiles, but well, clearly for engravings.
You might find, I haven't actually looked at it myself, but albarellos often have imagery sometimes that is nothing to do with the drugs that are being held inside them. Um,
Hmm.
but in order to have to do the painting, you pounce through with carbon and then that vanishes from the image. So it's a very useful way of transferring image onto quite an unstable material in order that when you're doing the stroke writing or marking afterwards. So you might find in certain environments, so particularly so albarellos with tin glaze that are made in um, Renaissance Italy and Spain, you see all sorts of images being used on the surface, partially because they're high status objects and they don't necessarily have any connection. I'm aware there are ones with dragons on. So, it may be that even if the person has no interest in alchemy, if they've been asked to put a dragon on the front of an albarello, they're just looking for an image of one that looks good enough to transfer, that's the right size. So that might be one of the things that you start seeing. If you know what you're looking for, you might, the Royal Company of Surgeons has a very good collection of that sort of material, so it might be worth having a look at that. Or, large applied arts collections might have some things that suddenly suddenly you recognize it's come from a manuscript because you've seen the original, but nobody working on those would have recognized it before.
The Science Museum, of course, has also
Yeah.
a big collection of albarellos, and yeah, the imagery is sometimes is fantastic. I mean, it's especially in the Italian origin. So yeah, I've seen some kind of dragons and things, and I mean, yeah, of course, it's like what does that have to do with anything? But yeah, they look amazing, so it's something to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, incredible. Thank you for this comment. I think we have to explore something like this. Yeah.
I mean, I'm mindful of the time, but I was just wondering actually if you know, to what extent people have looked at the pigments that are actually being used for these. I mean, to what extent these are important. I mean, if not just the colors, but actually what kind of pigments they use in this kind of manuscripts.
Yeah,
Are
well, I'm
you
not
doing
specialist in
research?
this particular area like pigments. I think, well, there is a recent Ambex volume produced by Jenny and collaborators on yellow. I think this is something to start with. And well, I mean, there is certainly a distinction between very elaborate pigments used in professional and commissioned manuscripts and this very simple ones made by alchemists themselves or by cheap artists, so to say, they are hired. That's probably all I have to say about pigments because I'm really not concentrating on them. But it's something to explore if we are looking for, pouncing, clearly.
Yeah, me?
Just to add, and this is not, yeah, he's right. Not very little work has been done on the technical aspects of these manuscripts, but there is a Bega in the Getty of a foolish alchemist who seems to have a little red dot of powder or something in his hand, and they did a testing on that, and it was vermilion. So it was, the chemical, sulfur and mercury, that is red that he's holding. So somebody knew enough to use that color in that painting, but lots still to do with the manuscripts.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the red seems like the obvious thing to test. I mean, it's like whether they use vermilion or not. It seems like like the right one, right? And
Yeah.
to use for that kind of thing. And I'm just saying because I also saw like this kind of this manuscript where they painted black, but the black was so strong, the ink, that it went through the paper, and that kind of made me think, okay. I mean, sometimes they want the color, but maybe they don't know how the paper will react to that kind of the chemical they're being using, and maybe it works on parchment, but maybe it doesn't work on paper, or all these aspects are so interesting in some way.
I think there is a project in Amsterdam right now which called like dark magic. It's not about magic at all. It's about dark pigments in manuscripts, and I think it's worth of seeing where it goes, because it just started, I think.
Interesting.
Probably they will make a book afterwards.
Emmy, sorry, you
Well, no,
had
just two
another
more.
comment.
It suddenly jumped into my mind when you were talking about uh, dark pigments, that in the Zurich aurora, the moon is black now because she was painted with silver, and so she's tarnished over time. That's one thing. And there's also in the Prague version of the aurora, there's a very like a lady alchemy, a sort of a allegorical figure. She's got the seven planets under her cape, and she was painted, I think, with a copper pigment that was green, but that's connected to the planet Venus. So I've always thought there was probably a symbolic connection for her as well. So
Yeah, that's really interesting. If some artists were actually into alchemy themselves, and they could imagine that copper is connected with Venus, and vermilion is connected with sulfur, mercury, cinnabar as well. So yeah, I only encountered not pigments, but powders, alchemical powders in manuscripts. Sometimes they designed the small envelopes and put it in there, or sometimes even small metallic probes, but these are not like pigments. It's more like metallic ingredients used for transplantation or as a result of transplantation. But clearly it was a part of the manuscript as well. So coloring this in a way, because you see the text and then suddenly small dots of silver, gold, and copper, which all alchemical, like artificial gold and so on.
Okay, I realize we're out of time. I mean, this, could go on for, but maybe privately. So, I mean, I would like to thank you, Sergey, for the very interesting presentation, and also for the amazing images. I mean, that you've been looking at and collecting throughout Europe, and um, so it's they're quite interesting, and this dynamic of the draft to the final, and back to draft, or something like this. It's also a fascinating aspect of visual culture, I think, which is great. You brought it up. So thank you again. Can I use this opportunity just in finishing to invite you next week, where we're also talking about symbolism, but in this case, it will be about Islamic symbolism. Yusuf Tayara from the University of Oxford, who is a PhD, DPhil at Oxford, will be talking about secrecy and ambiguity, some Mamluk sources on alchemical symbolism. So if you can, please join me for that. And again, thanks, Sergey, and we'll be in touch, of course, soon. So thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Joe. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone. Bye bye.